Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the third lecture hosted by the newly founded Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy in this semester. This is going to be our last lecture for this semester, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Kaushik Basu, who is talking to us this evening here and then is also giving a seminar at the Economics Department tomorrow. Professor Basu was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, but before that, he was Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He's had, in a sense, two parallel lives, one as an academic, a very distinguished academic, working on game theory, but also on questions of welfare. And then he decided to cross over into the real world, from econometrics into the world of policy making, and has been writing, fortunately for us in India, but also for wider audiences, on a variety of topics in very accessible prose, not equations. And therefore, I think he was going to be our first choice for an economist to invite to this series, not only for that reason, but also for a very special reason. He was invited by Albert Hirschman to join him at the Princeton Institute, and so he knew him personally, which makes it for us especially important that he's with us here today. He's currently professor of economics and the C. Marks Professor of International Studies at Cornell. At the Delhi School of Economics, which was my alma mater, he was professor of economics as well, and he founded there the Center for Development Economics. He has held very many visiting professorships at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, the LSE, and at Harvard. He is currently editor of Social Choice and Welfare. He has published, as I said, not only on game theory and welfare economics, he has published on development economics, industrial organization. The three book titles which I would like to mention for those of you unfamiliar with his work: Analytical Development Economics, and then a book which is a classic prelude to political economy, a study of the social and political foundations of economics, and the latest, Beyond the Invisible Hand, Groundwork for a New Economics. I remember one quote from an interview that you gave, Kaushik, where you said, where other people need to spend a lot of money to turn themselves into anthropologists, you have had the luxurious position of, just by living in India, turning yourself into an anthropologist, and thus an ethnographer of social and political life. So for, of course, an anthropologist, this is a great delight to have a common cause. And among the kinds of topics you have addressed, of course, as an economist, but with the eye of an anthropologist as well, are questions of child labor, but also questions of corruption, which have raised a lot of debate in India. And you have proposed very inventive solutions to the question of corruption. For example, making the proposal that we should disassociate the close link between the giver of bribes and the taker of bribes, both of whom have an interest in not disclosing the bribe. So by turning only bribe taking, but not bribe giving, into an offense, we might get somewhere in curbing corruption. This has been a much discussed proposal in a lot of public debates. I don't know if legislatively much will follow from that. But the other thing I would like to mention is your work on democracy. The book is called The Retreat of Democracy, and it's a collection of essays, very accessible, highly readable, witty, and very informative. They link in ways economic theory to political problems, to current political issues, and also to everyday lived reality in India. They talk about labor laws, about how hung parliaments can be prevented, about how alternative voting systems can be instituted. So issues which are very close to the ones that we would like discussed at the center on questions of economics and democracy. Now, let me just end my introduction by one of my favorite quotes from Albert Hirschman, because I think this is where he's talking about how concepts travel or how ideas from economics migrate into other disciplines and how they could or could not be productive. And I quote him, and he says, "There are serious pitfalls in any transfer of analytical tools and modes of reasoning developed within one discipline to another. As the economist, swollen with pride over the comparative rigor of his discipline, sets out to bring the light to his heathen colleagues in the other social sciences, he's likely to overlook some crucial distinguishing feature of the newly invaded terrain, which makes his concepts and apparatus rather less applicable and illuminating than he's wont to think. As in the case of imported ideologies, the distance between reality and intellectual schema is here likely to be both wider and more difficult to detect than was the case as long as the scheme stayed safely at home in its own discipline." So here is a nice warning from the imperialist designs that economics has had on many social sciences, but I think it's done very well in Albert Hirschman's own work, as it has done in your own as well, pointing to the very useful interactions between economics and politics, where they may have analogous structures or the structures of one can be used to illuminate the other, but also to think about concepts and modes of analysis which can be transferred and to think equally about their limits. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and welcome.
Shalini, thank you so much for that not only generous introduction, but you touched on themes that I'm going to discuss at some length. So it's a perfect introduction. Christine, thank you very much. She's a friend from a long time ago, so I'm seeing lots of friends here. And thank you also for the invitation to an institute named after Albert Hirschman. As Shalini just mentioned, I do owe him a lot to Hirschman because it was a very early break. In some ways, it's a very plain, simple career break for me that Albert Hirschman gave. He had come to Delhi in late 1984 visiting. I was familiar with his work, especially because if you've done your undergraduate studies in economics in India, you study a lot of Hirschman. Balanced, unbalanced growth, you may not study that in the US, but in India you would have done it. I had done all that. And then there was Hirschman. I remember at his talk, got into a bit of an argument. It's a civil, the kind of academic arguments you have. And next day we met at a social gathering in Delhi, where he came up to me and said that, would you consider coming to Princeton for a year? And, I fell back at an early stage of one's career to a statement like that. He said, I'll have to put your name up, and there's a committee that will look into that. So there's a piece of advice: get into arguments with people who come visiting. And it worked out. And I spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study, 85 to 86, and had plenty of interaction with Albert Hirschman. It influenced me in many ways. 4 years ago, I gave the Hirschman lecture in Mexico City. There I was talking on methodology, where Albert Hirschman has worked. And today I'm going to speak on roughly political economy, on democracy and globalization, touching on many of the topics that he had an interest in. The lecture that I'm going to give will be in two parts. The first part is very down-to-earth, practical concerns of the world, something that in my work in the World Bank And also before that in India, these were matters that were impinging on my day-to-day concerns. And I think it has a very important interface between globalization and democracy. That's what will the first part be. The second part, depending on how much time I have, it may get squeezed out. I am currently working on the role of beliefs in the running of a society. So the law, in the end, the law is nothing but a set of beliefs. It's a very Humean, David Humean agenda that I'm working on. So actually when I got these letters from Christine and Shalini about this lecture, I thought that will also give me an opportunity to try out some of those ideas that will be in the second part. And all this in the spirit of very open-ended. So I'm going to reach very few conclusions. So I'm warning you, if you're expecting very clear conclusions, you'll be disappointed. But on that, I can marshal again a little bit of Albert Hirschman to justify such an open-ended discussion. In one of his autobiographical essays written late in life, Hirschman talks about a very, at one level, innocuous incident in his personal life. His father was a surgeon, and well, Hirschman was quite young, I don't know, maybe 11, 12, 13, 14, somewhere there. The trouble is, when Hirschman wrote about this, he had forgotten which year. And he mentioned 2 years when he probably had this conversation. And I've forgotten which 2 years he mentioned. So I have to give you 4 years. Age of 11, 12, 13, 14, somewhere there. Albert Hirschman was in Berlin, and he started having a conversation with his father, and was asking questions on ideology, political positions, and was disappointed to find that his father didn't take any position on any of these matters. And he says he went running to his sister, elder sister, with whom he was very close, Ursula, and said in German that, Ursula, guess what? Daddy does not have a Weltanschauung view of the world and ideology. Daddy lacks that. And then in his old age, he's analyzing. He says, from that period, I've forgotten most things. The big things I remember, the small things are gone. This is a trivial incident. I remember this vividly. And he says, first I used to think I remember this because it showed up my father in a poor light. That there was this person, a well-known surgeon, he did not have an ideology, a worldview. But he said, I later came to believe that this is stuck in my head because it showed me in poor light. It is the self-examination that I had very strong views at that time. And only later in life that this would get diluted. Ifs and buts and questions would impinge on me. And I don't have clear views. It's all open-ended. And it was for me a moment of embarrassment about my self-confidence is probably the reason why this trivial incident is stuck in my head. There are also some beautiful quotes. I have them here from Ken Arrow about the openness of inquiry, skepticism. But the time is short, so if I have time later, I'll come back to that. With that, let me get into the first very practical topic. I believe that globalization is diminishing the quality of democracy in the world. And it's making it worse. So democracy is under challenge. It's being eroded by globalization. And we have to do something to meet up to this challenge. And I mean this in quite a definite sense, and I'm going to clarify. Don't take up immediately a normative position that I'm saying globalization is therefore bad. Not at all. In fact, on balance, I think globalization is a good thing. But my most important thing on globalization is I typically don't take a line on globalization because globalization is not something that you can do anything about. It's a part of life. It's happening slowly. It'll continue to happen as technology changes. So it's a bit like discussing the good and bad of globalization is a bit like having a discussion on whether gravity is a good thing or a bad thing. You can have a discussion, but it's a completely pointless discussion. And globalization to me is something similar. I do believe it's, on balance, it's a good thing, but the discussion of globalization is not the point. It's a fact, it's happening, but it's encroaching. How is it encroaching? In a particular sense, but let me tell you, one particular problem of democracy and and the world economy, which is always there, but I think that's getting harder. Democracy has many sides to it. this morning, Ugo and I were talking about Lipset's view and Acemoglu and others, and I will hopefully have a bit of a chance to come back to this. But there are parts of democracy which are very sort of well-defined, like everyone having a vote. Universal suffrage is a part of a democracy. So there are some well-defined parts, but there are also parts which are in the human mindset, how you think about the world, how much respect do you have for other people's rights. Those things also matter. I'll come to those things later. But this one person, one vote, we treat as very central, that whoever is a leader being chosen to a position that can affect your well-being, in the choice of that leader, you should be able to cast a vote, whether that person is chosen or not. You can get overruled by other people voting otherwise, but a person who has an effect, his or her actions influence your well-being, you should be able to cast a vote for that person. But with global, so this is many countries adopted it. India is a good example of a country that adopted this. But this is beginning to get eroded in the following sense. As globalization takes place, one country's leader, what that person does, can have huge effects on other people's, people in other countries, their well-being. It is entirely arguable that for a Mexican, more important than who becomes the leader of Mexico is who becomes the leader of the United States. You can have your trade treaty turned around. You can have a movement of people through money supply. You can influence one another's well-being in a huge way. This I know from my practical experience in India during when I was the chief advisor to the government. I used to do a lot of G20 work. And every time there was a G20 work meeting, we would gather the emerging economy representatives sort of in the corridors, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil. And we would talk about the easy money policy in these rich countries having spillover effects on inflation in our countries, so one country can affect another. But people, of course, can't vote for the choice of other countries' leaders. Mexicans do not have a say about what happens in an American presidential election. When you say this, of course, it sounds absurd, and indeed, in today's global structure, it's an impossibility. How can you have that? But not to have that is a weakness of democracy in the same way as, suppose in the United States the rule was, only people living in Washington, D.C. will vote to choose the president of United States. One person, one vote, no discrimination, everyone in D.C. gets to vote. The president of United States gets chosen, who has, of course, effects on people living in California, on New Jersey, New York, all over. We would think it's a very weird democracy, and people's well-being is not being represented. At one level, the world is inching towards that. Because as globalization takes place, leaders can influence one another's well-being in a big way, and we do know that leaders of big countries, especially, have a huge power in influencing well-being in smaller countries, and the world history is full of accounts of how big countries have been completely unmindful of the well-being of small countries and bulldozed over them in pursuing their own interests. You know, years ago in India, a story used to go around about Stalin, who had very little interest, had a huge amount of interest in his immediately neighboring countries, to their chagrin, but had very little interest in the rest of the world. So the Indian story used to be that an Indian diplomat who's posted in Moscow goes to visit Stalin, and Stalin has no idea about India, where it is, what. So the diplomat takes out a map and is showing that this is India. So Stalin gets very excited, said, well, India's quite a big country. I didn't realize that. And then he notices the small island just below India, points to that, and says that, what is the name of this Indian island? To which the Indian diplomat says, sir, this is not an Indian island. It's a sovereign nation. It's Sri Lanka, a sovereign nation. To which Stalin responds, why? Because for Stalin, next to such a big country, a sovereign nation is an anomaly. Now, that's a tongue-in-cheek remark, but there is very often the insensitivity to smaller countries, smaller powers around the world. This problem is getting worse today because of two kinds of changes: monetary policy spillovers, I'll briefly touch on that, labor market policy spillovers. I want to spend a bit of time on the labor market policy spillovers. I want to digress a little bit by giving you one background on the value of democracy. That I'm treating that as an axiom, that democracy is worthwhile. In forms, yes, the one vote, one person, one vote is not good enough. You need other things, but overall, it is the desirable system. I'm fully aware that there are countries which have grown very rapidly over short periods because of its lack of democracy, but democracy gives you a certain stability. And to me, the biggest example in the world of advantage from democracy is India, because India is a bit of an anomaly. It went in for a democratic system very early, when it was a very poor country. It's still a poor country, but 1947, India becomes independent. There are not too many examples of a country that decides to be a democracy. And the one country, one vote was, of course, very quickly adopted, but the other institutions of democracy in India came about quite slowly, gradually. And I feel that India stands on a very strong footing today because it made this early investment in what is the most difficult investment: democratic and secular polity. These things can erode. You have to be continuously on your guard, and the mindset becomes important. But this early investment is today's India's rapid growth. India's growing at over 7% per annum. Its immediate cause, I think, are a set of reforms which go back, the most important ones, go back to 1991 to 1993, which triggered a lot of energy. But there was also the early investment in democracy, which played a role, important role in India. And it's always worthwhile to remember that these things can get eroded. I will come back to that when I talk of mindsets. Very easily, India also had an episode, which those of you who know India well will know, the Indian emergency, which was 1975 to 1977, when Indira Gandhi took total dictatorial control over India. No law had to be changed, a constitutional provision was used, and using that, she took control in quite a dramatic way. The last evening, when she's taking this decision, no one in the world knows. There are a few lawyers, a few people close to her, and her youngest son, who later died in a plane crash, Sanjay Gandhi. They were around discussing that next morning she's going to spring a surprise on the country by going on the radio and declaring an emergency. In fact, the account of that last day is, to me, a very, very fascinating last day before this is declared. At 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock at night, as the advisors are leaving Indira Gandhi's home, and next morning she would announce that she's taking full control of the country. One of them, the lawyer, who turns around and says that, you know, one thing is we have to remember, the Indian press is a very lively press. And as soon as you declare emergency, the media is going to go wild criticizing you. Her son comes out, Sanjay Gandhi, and says, you don't have to worry about that because I have decided, I have given orders, electricity will be cut off from these publishing houses so that you'll get 1 or 2 days of newspapers being interrupted, during which time we can arrest the opposition and bring the system under control. Fortunately, Indian inefficiency at times comes in handy. 2 newspapers did come out, so right from the beginning you were getting accounts of what was happening. So that was a 2-year period, 21 months, and then Indira Gandhi called an election in 77 and lost it roundly. Usually, people with dictatorial controls don't call an election, and there's been a lot of speculation on why she called it. There are people who say it was arrogance, the arrogance of a person who's taken full control. But I have done a lot of research on this, including from sources that I can't disclose, and I believe now she had got into psychologically, she was very troubled by this. Her father had founded democracy and secularism in India. She was dislodging one part of it. She wanted to see and there are people close to her who say she knew that it was more than likely she would lose the elections. She called it. A fair election was run, and she was routed in that. So India had a 2-year brush, and this is a reminder for countries, especially early-stage democracy, but even late-stage democracy can run into trouble if you're not forever vigilant. Let me come back to the globalization, as I was talking about, and labor and money. On money, very, very briefly, okay, I invested in water there, but there's also on my right. On money, what's happening in the world is this is a technical problem, technical not in a mathematical sense, but technical because it involves central banking. Central banking is really part technical matters, part mysticism. No one fully understands, but you conduct policy nevertheless. Money supply is very interesting. It was decided sometime in the 17th century that competition is good for most things in life. More producers producing clothes, producing food, producing cars will improve quality and do good for the country. But one thing you don't want competition. You don't want many money-creating authorities. Riksbank was set up 1668 or plus or minus around then. Bank of England, 1694, I know, comes up. Gradually, one after another, central bank is coming up, and it's becoming soon a rule that only the central bank can print money. You can't print money and unleash it on the economy. One economy, one money creator. See how globalization is eroding that. Today, the world economy is gradually pooling into one economic space. Goods flow freely from one country to another. Money flows even more freely through a variety of channels, and that was a reference I made. The US Fed injects liquidity in America, you get inflation in Vietnam. And this is now well documented that these things flow and can cause that. So you are getting this world where increasingly it's a single economy, but one country, one central bank was created. EU, there are exceptions like the EU, but still clusters with a central bank. So you've got back again into the 17th century world where you have one economy with many money-creating authorities. And I believe, and this is lots of people over here, that you need much better coordination of central bank policy than is happening in the world now, because each country does it for itself, what the country's own well-being. This has huge spillover effects for others. For instance, I believe on a very specific matter where the Swiss are also involved, this negative interest rate regime that several central banks went into, the initial experiment was worthwhile, but when they were all sitting there, 6 or 7 central banks with negative interest rates, I think it was evident to all of them it's not working. But no one could individually pull out, because as soon as you pull out and push your interest rates up, your exchange rate is going to move up, your exports will suffer, so you get into a prisoner's dilemma trap. You need global institutions for countries to work together on this. But the bigger challenge now, and something which is affecting us politically, is technology and labor. Technological innovation has taken place right from the Stone Age and before that. Every little equipment you're discovering, inventing, you're saving labor and going into that. What is special about today's world is there are 2 kinds of technological innovations taking place together. One is labor-saving technology, like has happened eternally. The other is a labor-linking technology. You can sit in one country, you can sit in Bangalore or Manila, and work for a company in Geneva or New York, and supply goods to customers in Berlin or London. Through technology, you can sit far away and work for other places. This is beginning to make a difference worldwide. One of the big differences that in all rich countries and middle-income countries, the labor market is coming under a kind of competitive attack. Either the wages are dropping, not keeping pace, or unemployment is picking up, because through labor linking technology, other parts of the world are linking up with this. This is actually sufficiently dramatic that I want you to look at some numbers. I may not, don't get alarmed, I may never come back to those pictures. Okay, but I want you to see what's in front of you there. This is over from 1975 to the year 2015. A whole lot of people are now beginning to write about this. One very striking thing happening, and it's very surprising that all the literature on this is over the last 4 or 5 years. This is a trend from 1975. If you take the entire GDP, the share that is accruing to workers as wage bill is shrinking in virtually all industrialized countries. New Zealand looks like a bit of an exception, but actually it's not an exception. It had a blip between 95 and 2015. Before that, the data is a bit dicey, but it is falling. And I can give you another set of countries. All of them, you will see this trend. In emerging economies, it's not quite as uniform, but even there, the better off emerging economies, it's falling. In the poorest economies, it's not yet happening. In a few of them, especially ones which are able to take advantage of labor linking technology and work for other countries. And this, I know India will also soon come under strain. It's not yet under strain on this, but this is a very important matter. Again, the knee-jerk reaction to this is very often protectionism. I had written about this a long time ago. In around 2003, 4, 5, every evening on American television, there would be spokespeople, usually conservative spokespeople, who will talk in terms of the dreadful thing about profit-maximizing Americans who, for the sake of profit, are sending their work out. The effect that had was the exact opposite of what was intended. You know, advertising on primetime American channel and saying that if you come to us with your work, we can help you make more profit is so expensive that these small shops in Cape Town, Bangalore, Manila would never be able to advertise in America that there is profit to be made by sending your work out to us. But every evening saying that some American entrepreneurs are making extra profit by sending their work out had exactly that primetime advertisement effect. And around that time, you can see a pickup in small back office work. Certainly in India, it picks up in a great way, and it's happening all over the world. What should you do about this? I feel, and this I've had now several discussions with several people, the way the problem is being posed is the wrong way. It is being treated as a labor versus labor problem. That it's workers in a faraway country competing with our workers. There is some competition, but you have to keep in mind, these are abysmally poorer workers who are coming into the global labor market. To block them from coming in has just no moral basis. But what you also have to remember is this is also a labor versus capital matter, which very seldom gets attention. Every time work is shipped out to another country, profit shoots up where you're running this operation. So the workers are losing out and profit is increasing. And this is also true with technology. Industrial robot production is shooting up. It's increasing at the rate of roughly 20 to 30% per annum. Industrial robots are being produced. They are beginning to take away jobs. And what's happening is not that the workers, just the jobs are going, but along with that, what was earlier wage is becoming profit. The owners of the robots are beginning to earn what was earlier earned by workers. I feel that is where this needs to be addressed. You need some global coordination of policy, but you also need to think in terms of intelligent ways of profit sharing. I know there was a referendum in Switzerland on universal basic income. My own view is you want to keep the profit motive in place. Instead of a universal basic income, some amount of profit sharing is worthwhile. So something like 10% of a nation's profit gets distributed to workers. Workers have right to that. So in good years, you earn more, bad years, you have ownership of this. As soon as you talk in terms of people getting an income without working directly, people will come, and very serious scholars, that look, there's also a pleasure, the dignity of work. You're taking that away if you give people just the benefits. But if work is going down in the world, which is bound to happen, which is what Thomas More and his utopia had idealized about a world with 4 hours per day of work. If you're heading towards such a world, you have to think in terms of the sharing and workers getting some income, which does not come from work, but they are working less and getting that. Moreover, this criticism we make that, look, just giving people some money or shares is hurting their dignity. We never made that argument in feudal times when the leisure classes, very well off, did hardly any work. Europe had a lot of that. They earned a huge amount. Thorstein Veblen's work is on that. And we didn't feel bad that they were feeling so diminished by the fact that they were earning huge amounts from their farmlands, not having to work at all, just because they had the right to that land. Likewise, if you give people some rights to a part of the profit, and I'm very mindful of the fact that you can't do this foolishly, you want profit motive for entrepreneurship, and also you can't destroy it across the board, but a certain share being given to workers, something like that you have to do. And the problem is going to get acute worldwide. So Piketty has been writing about this famously, but others have been also, that this has to be thought of in terms of global policies. You cannot isolate some countries altogether. If you do, their people will try to come in physically through other routes into your space, creating another kind of problem for the world, but more for themselves, because as we know, people perishing on the route as refugees, they try to move in. So this is a problem that needs a very general equilibrium kind of exercise, where you are addressing simultaneously sharing within the country and sharing across countries, for which you need global institutions to work with. There are examples. I do want to spend a little bit of time on my last, the slightly abstract bit, but I should point out, it's not that manufacturing work is stopping in rich countries. There are some lovely accounts now in the United States. There are some cities which were in very bad shape are getting revived. Manufacturing is coming up. Very close to Ithaca, upstate New York, Buffalo was one such town, and manufacturing is returning to Buffalo. There is one company called Eastman Company, which is quite celebrated because they are making machines for apparel and textile industries, and they are making the machines so efficiently that they are managing to sell to Vietnam and Bangladesh. But how is Eastman surviving in the US? If you look at their budget sheet, you will realize of the cost, their total cost of production, 3% is labor. So they have minimized labor altogether. It's machines that have replaced these workers, and the machines are doing the bulk of the work, and with a tiny amount of labor to run this operation, they are doing this. This is something that technology will continue to do. The demand for labor is going to go down. Two things might happen in the world. One is it's possible that our growth rates will pick up massively, in which case, though the demand for labor goes down, if overall growth rate becomes 30% per annum, 40% per annum, the world is on an exponential trajectory. Workers are not growing as rapidly, but they are not being left by the wayside as possible. The other is we have to think in terms of innovative forms of sharing within countries and across the countries. And some of the tensions you're seeing in the Middle East, I believe, have to do with this globalization of the labor market, that there is turmoil, people are losing their jobs, their work, it's beginning to go elsewhere, and that is causing a form of disquiet. The disquiet is there in rich industrialized countries, but the disquiet is taking more violent forms in the poorer, but still relatively the middle income kind of countries are facing the brunt of this. Leaders, the choice of leaders, sensitivity to other countries, these are pressures that we have to bring on these countries. But we have to bring on leadership, we have to think of global institutions. And international organizations play a very important role. I've written about this, actually a full paper, on given that there is no such thing as a global government, international organizations that straddle many countries play a very, very special role to make up for this deficiency of global democracy. You need to get them to function better, to give greater voice to poorer countries in the IMF and World Bank. There is a lot of work and activism that you at least minimally want to reach a state where the emerging economies have more than 50% of the vote, which they currently don't, so that they have, if they can all get together on a particular issue, they can have a blocking coalition on certain matters. So international organizations need to work on this. Even if you get, of course, one country, one vote, there will be behind-the-scenes activism, but that is true even in a democratic system within a country. Even though you have one person, one vote, there are ways in which that gets distorted. But the minimum thing of universal suffrage, in the case of the world, it's at least one country, one vote, if you can minimally go to. Something like that is worth striving towards, and through international organizations to give them voice. But there is more to democracy than one person, one vote, or one country, one vote, or the formal laws and regulations. For this, I want to go into my second part, and where I want to take you back to something that was an early interest of mine, and this has a very direct bearing on Albert Hirschman, and so I thought this is a good occasion to touch on this topic. It's another face of democracy and dictatorship, which comes not through the de jure system, but de facto, through culture, through other means, and we have to be sensitive to this. This also fits in with the work I'm doing on a book right now, so for me, this is an ideal time to get into that and get some of your reactions. The obverse of democracy is dictatorship, totalitarianism. And we usually think of totalitarianism as an individual or a small group taking authoritarian control over a country. One essay which for me was extremely influential very early is an essay by Václav Havel called The Power of the Powerless. And again, it was great luck for me to bump into this paper well before it was published in English, because I was visiting my advisor, Amartya Sen, in Oxford, when at a dinner I was seated next to a political philosopher, Stephen Lukes. And dinner time conversation, this was in the early 80s, and I had a still sort of early career. Very sheepishly, I was telling Stephen Lukes about my interest in power. When Lukes said that, well, have you heard of Václav Havel? I said no, and I now realize it's a very embarrassing thing to say, even in the early 1980s, no, I have not heard of Václav Havel. He was, of course, a very well-known playwright and a very important dissident figure already in Czechoslovakia. But then Luke said that then, if you're interested in power, I'll have to give you a paper which has been smuggled out of Czechoslovakia. Havel wrote it when he was in a jail. He wrote it in 1978. It was available in English much later when Lukes did the translation of that piece. And he gave me this copy, a dog-eared copy in the olden days. That's the kind of thing. There's no electronic transmission of The Power of the Powerless. And I remember reading it, that it was almost like a trained game theorist writing this essay, the way Havel is writing. Of course, Havel has no knowledge of game theory. John Nash has already made contributions. I don't think Havel knew either of John Nash or an equilibrium called Nash equilibrium. But what he was arguing was very similar, and this gives us an insight into totalitarianism, and by virtue of that, into democracy on the other side. Havel argues that totalitarianism is not, especially in the modern day, not one person or a small group of people being the evil ones and everyone else being oppressed. It's a system that permeates through society. And he called that a post-totalitarian system. And he goes on to describe this society. He never names Czechoslovakia or Eastern Europe, but it's very clear that that's what he's describing. And his description is very close to the use of Nash's equilibrium concept, but I'm going to tell you in words, try to convey this. He says the way this system runs is mutual fear. People fear one another, and in the end, everybody is a perpetrator, allowing the system to flourish and continue, and everybody is a victim. Yes, some people suffer more as victims, some people may even gain, but it is entirely possible that no one wants the system to survive, but the system has got locked in. And the example he gives is the following. The example he gives is that of a greengrocer who in this country puts up a sign on the window which is a declaration of loyalty to the regime. It's all kinds of slogans on the wall saying, I believe in the regime, I'm loyal to the regime. And Havel is asking that anyone who sees this has a good question to ask, is this greengrocer really loyal to the regime? And Havel says no. Typically, greengrocers in this country, which I know very well, are not loyal to the regime. Why do they put up this? Because they don't want to be hurt by others. So they don't want the party bosses to come and harass them. They don't want their children go to a school. They don't want the school principal to say that your children have to be taken out. And this declaration of loyalty is what allows you to function smoothly in society. That we know. Even children in playgrounds will do things to sort of win over approval from others. But there's a second level question that Havel asks, and that's the game theory question. Havel says, okay, the greengrocer does this, we understand, in order not to annoy the party boss, not to annoy the school principal, and other such people they have to interact with. But why would the party boss get angry if the greengrocer does not put up this sign? Why would the headmaster get angry? And Havel reaches a conclusion for the same reason as the greengrocer. If someone is called disloyal and you do not punish that person when it's within your ability to punish, you will be called disloyal. You will be harassed by others. So the party boss also could be mimicking loyalty to the party without any real interest in supporting the party. The headmaster could be doing that. And Havel goes on to say, at one level, it's a very generous description, that this society could be locked in, right from people at the top to ordinary citizens, all mimicking a kind of loyalty for the regime that no one can get out of. Whoever stands up first is going to be shot down and brought down. This appealed to me because I immediately started thinking in terms of the Indian setting, and I had thought of actually a lot of Indian customs. George Akerlof has a beautiful paper on the Indian caste system, where Akerlof's argument is very, very similar to Havel's argument in terms of just the abstract reasoning. And Akerlof is arguing about why in India you have this system of outcasting someone. Someone is an outward caste, and if you go and sit at a table and have a meal with that person, you will be outcast and you refuse to do that. Akerlof says that it's possible, it's not necessary, that no one wants the system to continue. It's not necessary, but it's possible. But everyone is trapped. If you associate with someone who is an outcast, you will become an outcast, and so you allow the system to survive. And I have examples from my family and local customs. I've written about that. Shalini referred to anthropology. The precise thing I had said is, I was born in northern Calcutta, which is a very densely populated, poor part of the city, very overcrowded area, and in a small house with a massive joint family. My father, there were 8 brothers, 8 wives, lots of children, some sane, some not very sane. It's all kinds of people in this small house I was born into. And the observation I had made is that there are lots of anthropologists who would spend a lot of money, raise funds from National Science Foundation to get there. I was dropped over there, so I was very lucky. So I was in a setting where I could observe and see. And I talk about parallels of these systems getting trapped. And there are other examples you can think of. So Havel's argument, Havel does not put it in those terms, is an abstract argument. But it's an argument that applies widely, and that's a warning to democracy. Democracy also depends a lot on human beliefs about one another. And this awareness, I'm going to give you a concrete example to clarify this. I'm not quite sure what you should do once you understand that these are traps that we get into, that we are all pawns in a dreadful system that we are creating. But a lot of our climate change, environmental challenges of that kind, today we've learned that something may not be in your self-interest, but still you should do it. Turning the tap off when you're not using it may not be worthwhile for you to pain your fingers by turning the tap, but it's so much better for the world that you should go through that. So understanding a system and the collective problem very often helps us to work it. And that's the spirit in which I want to present this, that this is something we need to understand as a first step. How you solve it, how you correct it, I don't know, but I think the analysis is correct. And here's one more example. And this is in a democracy, how institutions can begin to crumble. And it's, again, a very Havel-type description. Havel's criticism was against communism. And I do believe that communism fell into this in a dreadful way. You were trapping the system in a kind of autocracy, in a totalitarian system, happened across the board. But the risk is there for all countries. There can be a mistaken voter choice, which can plunge you into that. It's happened in Germany. It's happened in other places in the world. So you have to be careful about that. But it can happen in other ways. 1950, 9th February, is an important day in the United States. Senator Joseph McCarthy went to a Women's Republican Club, Women's Republican Society, something like that. Women's Republican is certainly there, in a small town in West Virginia, and said that I have document with me that at least 57 people in the State Department are either card-carrying communists or total supporters of the communist regime, infiltrated into the US. And if the US is going to survive, we have to go after these people. And a period started, which lasted for 4 years, where we know this from films and stories that people were being described as un-American or communists, and this was spreading. And the problem that arose was, again, the mechanism for this spreading is very similar to the mechanism for spreading. In economics, there's a term we call, in certain situations, is that infection which spreads. In game theory, we call this infection. And the way it was happening is as follows. Someone points to someone and says that that actor, who's a very prominent person in Hollywood, is un-American. If you say, no, 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 I know this person, I'm an American, that person is an American, he is very American, immediately it'll be, why are you protecting that person? Then you are un-American. And if someone says that, look, no, Kaushik is not un-American at all, just protecting that person, then why are you protecting someone who's become un-American by protecting someone who has been declared un-American? You are un-American. The McCarthy period was spreading in this manner, and there are accounts of people who are going completely silent, and people who were being rounded up mechanically. This went on for 5 years, vitiating the democratic atmosphere in the United States. I think the US was lucky. There were people, there was a couple of Supreme Court judges who were speaking up, and McCarthy also tried to take on the military. By 1954, fortunately, there was a counter movement that had started. Joe must go was the slogan that picked up, and McCarthyism came crashing to a halt. What is interesting about the McCarthy period is it happened without changing the law. Nothing de jure needed to be changed. It is people's beliefs about one another. What will leave you safe is what locks you into this dreadful system. So there are situations in life where you have to stand up and speak. And it's also fully understandable that in dreadful situations we won't. You don't want to be shot standing up. But at least in early stages when you see these tendencies, take some moves, some steps, some measures, because the mindset matters. These are the kinds of analysis that you can take through to get a society to behave in a particular way. And Shalini, another 5 minutes, is that all right? Then let me use the last 5 minutes to take you just a bit further from this, is in the end, and this is the extreme position that I am taking in what I'm working on now, even the law, what we describe as de jure, as different from de facto, even the law, in the end, is in our minds. And that's what gives law the power. I've been working on this for a while. David Hume takes a position in a couple of pieces he wrote in 1858, where it's a position very close to this without the artillery of game theory, which he did not have. So he does not reach concrete conclusions, but it's very comforting to have someone like David Hume, and I'm an across-the-board admirer of David Hume, take a position like this, so I can assert this with a little bit greater strength. In the end, I do believe that contrary to the line that economists have taken, the Chicago School view of law and law and economics as it was born in the 1960s, in the end, in the ultimate analysis, the law has to be in the human mind. And let me explain in the following way. What does a law do? Standard response of people who do law and economics is a new law changes the payoff that people receive from certain actions. So very, very simply, a new law comes into your country. Earlier, you were allowed to drive at 70 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour, but a new law comes in saying you can't drive above 60 miles per hour. You have to go below that. What does that do? Well, when you are about to drive, earlier you would think if I drive very fast, yes, there's a chance of a skid that could harm me, but I'll reach my destination quicker. On balance, it's either worth it or not worth it. Now, after the new law comes in, you will do all those calculations plus one more calculation. If I drive fast, I might be stopped by a police, and the police will charge me a fine, so that is an additional thing. So the payoff of driving fast has become different. But look at it by pulling the police person also into the game. The game of life, as Binmore talks about, is a game in which everyone is a player. The judge, the police, and toss everyone in. Then you can begin to wonder that if everyone is a player, in the end, what is a law? A law is nothing but a little bit of ink on paper. If you've spilt a little bit of ink on paper, written a couple of words, why should that change the game of life? Why should that change the payoff? And in one very important sense, it does not. If I behave the same way after the speed limit law as I did earlier, drive fast, and the police also behaves the same way after the law, and the judge also behaves the same way, then the new law remains a piece written on paper with no effect. And emerging economies, even in rich countries, I have examples. There are lots of examples where the law is, everybody looks the other way. In the end, the law is nothing but some ink on paper. If it makes the police person behave differently, it's that ink on paper that creates beliefs. What belief does it create? It creates beliefs about one another, expectations about one another's behavior. So I expect, once the law is there, I expect the police to catch me if I drive fast. And the police fears that if the police person does not catch me every time I drive fast, the police person might lose his or her job for not doing a job properly, and the person who sacks the police also does it for a similar reason. So what the law does in the end is it creates, in the language of economics, a new focal point in the heads of people. Our expectations of one another begin to change. And it is this expectation change that drives the equilibrium that you get after the law. And just by way of closing word, I want to tell you that since these mindset and the effect of the mindset on the outcome, all you can do, right now we don't quite know where you take on this problem. The World Bank has a wonderful World Development Report, you should see that, called Mind, Society and Behavior, which is all about mindsets and the role of mindsets in development. But this takes us to the point that many people have come to this from other points of view. Calabresi has argued that human basic morals, and by morals I don't mean what is taught in a religious textbook, but morals in terms of basic values, caring for one another, consideration, compassion, it's the sort of enlightenment values. These are, first of all, I think, innate in us. They get eroded, they get destroyed by our circumstances. But once you recognize that that's important, you begin to live by that a little bit and make an effort, because human behavior does change depending on your circumstances. There are these lovely laboratory experiments where you take students from different disciplinary backgrounds, economists, sociologists, psychologists, physicists, into rooms and make them play games in which you can be more selfish or less selfish. And this paper by Tom Gilovich, Bob Frank, there may be one more co-author, it's a very celebrated paper, shows that economists play games the most selfishly. I don't think that is because economists are selfish, but if you are reading books where all the time you're told that the normal behavior is selfish behavior, we all have a bit of an urge to be normal, and you begin to behave the way you're told you should behave. So behavior, a lot of it is what we learn, and once you begin to understand the world has this mindset component, you do these experiments, which of course is Kantian. If I were you, you ask questions. If I were you, what would I want you to do? And to use that as a sort of premise of universalizability, and I'm going to end with one little quotation from Kenneth Arrow. This is an old one, 1952, who he wrote, so many of you may know about this. Arrow is stressing that having the compassion and thinking, putting yourself in the other person's shoes is important. And this is an epitaph, Arrow says, written on someone's tombstone. And Arrow puts this up as an example. Here lies Martin Engelbrod. Have mercy on my soul, Lord God, as I would do were I Lord God and thou wert Martin Engelbrod. Thank you very much. I can sit here.
Thank you very, very much for this really rich lecture, which has covered so many topics. I don't know where people want to go with their questions, from some really technical ones to questions of from money supply to labor markets to automation. To political choice, matters of democracy, of course, and then finally ending up not only with the law, but thinking very differently about the law. I don't know if there are lawyers in the room. There certainly are economists. So we'll just wait and see where the discussion goes. And with that, let me first open to the floor.
Thank you very much. Defne Gönenç. I'm a PhD student at the Institute. Is that open? Yeah. I'd like to ask about the relevancy of democracy in a capitalist system. How do I arrive at this conclusion? I agree with you that now increasingly we see a lot more central bank players in the world making money, but still it's the bank which makes money, right? And who makes the investment decisions? It's the investment bankers, wealth managers behind their computers, deciding the investment, how it flows, according to the profit making. So take me, for instance, as an individual. How can I interfere into the system as an individual, apart from the fact that I am a consumer at the end of a very blurred, commodity chain analysis? So as an individual, how can I make a difference in the system, in a system of democracy?
But then I won't be able to hear the questions.
No, then we have
Okay.
to.
Okay.
Yes. So you can sit and we'll fire.
Yeah. Okay. Ugo, were you going to ask something? Then?
No.
Ugo was just
Okay.
he was helping.
Okay.
So you have the mic.
Okay. So, yeah, I hadn't forgotten I had the mic, though that could happen. But I thought we were taking on one more, but let me take this, actually, it's better. So, what you're talking about is, it's very closely related to what I was saying. The changing nature of the economy game is causing people to get, a small group to get wealthier and wealthier. And a variety of reasons, actually, that this is happening. But I feel technology is playing a very major role, that a small group is becoming wealthier and a large number remaining actually pretty badly off. You can see one little piece of information which to me was very interesting. I had worked in the World Bank once, 1997-98, and I worked recently. When I left the World Bank in 1998, and when I left the World Bank in 2016, last year, the median person's income in the United States was slightly lower the second time, 2016, compared to 1998. US has become much richer since then. The top end is just blowing up. What does one do about this, and how do you use a democratic system to sort of attend to these kinds of problems? Again, for an individual, this is a problem of the world. Very little you can do. If you stand up and scream, that's going to have no effect. I feel one reason why there will be gradually a change coming in this is it's causing so much of political dissension. I feel voting patterns in a whole lot of countries are going awry because people are getting very upset about the system. They have no idea what to do. They are just casting their vote thinking that someone who's going to shake up the system is the person I want. Very often, of course, that person could be making the system even worse, the person you've brought in. Little hope comes for the wrong reasons, that there's so much turbulence in the world that people will get together to think in terms of what to do. But I'm not 100% sure that'll happen. We could destroy the fabric of society so badly, the fabric of polity so badly, that the world could destroy itself. Like climate change was a genuine fear that we could bring our own end by destroying the climate. We could bring our own end by destroying the system and distributions of income so dreadfully that there's chaos and we are not able to do anything. But on climate change, we've woken up. At least there are big movements. On inequality and the game of economy changing and the inequality that is coming out of that, we need to get into the act and think hard about this. One of the things where I believe this needs determination and activism, you do need people out shouting and saying something needs to be done, but that needs to be matched with a certain amount of brain power to design what is it that you're after. I say this because of the great failure of the communist regimes. You know, communism was instinctively against democracy. There are dreadful aspects of it. But the early stage, and you're thinking of Marx and Engels and others, these were idealists. They were trying to create a system which would be a better world. I feel the big mistake was that the path to this was being thought out, but after you get the system, how do you run it? Very little thought was given. And what has happened repeatedly is in communist countries, the power and wealth get centralized. Then big players begin to eye that pot which is all together. And communism was ending up in the last stage as crony capitalism. Few people capture that. You need to think in terms of a society, which is a better society where the incentives are extremely important. I think that's one huge mistake they made. You want enterprise, you want people to be creative and earn rewards from that. But that needs to be corrected with certain kinds of redistribution. Certainly one redistribution which takes place through dynastic lines, people's children being left rich or poor, it has no moral basis. There's a traditional school in economics that will say that some people are richer because they choose to work harder. But the bulk of human inequality takes place at birth. You're either being born shockingly poor in a slum or so rich that it'll be impossible for you to become poor. And it's not because some babies love hard work and some babies like to lie down and cry. It's the system which does this. So there's a lot of thought to be given. I hope that the way in climate and environment, the world has been energized and we are thinking beyond just market solutions, that will happen on this. I give long answers is the warning.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Anna Biondi from the ILO. I'm certainly most interested in this discussion about democracy that is not only political but is also socio-economic democracy. And actually we have seen also that, for example, the representative bodies, there is a strong attack on representative bodies like trade unions, not only against political parties, but I think that, and this often is seen like, something corporatist, while instead, it's like it's also a way for having a representation. But if this, it's like it's one part of the equation. I was really interested, though, in asking you a question about the global institution and the policy coherence. You mentioned at the beginning of your intervention that you have been working with the Indian government on the G20. And actually, it's like someone could see like, well, this is kind of a club of a few, while you were talking about one vote, one country. So can you tell us a little bit more how you see this reform of the multilateral system and how, we bring policy coherence where I would say also the ILO would bring workers' rights in this quest for social justice. Thank you.
let me take this on. It's quite a substantial question. I'm taking the last part, reform, multilateral, G20, also a small club. G20 has two problems. It is, of course, a small club, but it also may not be the right club. So another possibility is to think in terms of G major, which is the major economies, at least creating a forum for themselves, and it'll be, on my count, 24, 25 countries will be there, and not all the ones which are here currently will be there, but you've got a cluster taking some of those decisions. But that also still leaves open the question, what about the other countries? This is, of course, a perennial problem, that if you give voice to everyone, the voice encroaches on the efficiency of the decision making. On the other hand, if you don't give that voice to people, then it is not a system, it's a system that is tilting towards injustice. But I suppose we have to create, but to me, the balance is between giving a broad voice to all countries. That's why I believe that in international organizations, one country, one vote is a sort of ideal that you should move towards. That will make, of course, some of the meetings which are smooth with 20, 30 countries will have a cacophony of voices. But then, certain decisions will have to be done in specialized group. You can't have everything being done by everyone. And this problem I see in my work in India, which I used to feel very often, is India has some advantages of being a democracy, very strong voice ordinary people have. But it also very often drowns out the voice of the expert. And there is a perennial dilemma. If you are, when it comes to economic policy, you get everyone taking a position on fiscal deficit, on taxation, on tariffs, what should it be? In engineering, we realize that you can't do that. When you're building a plane, people don't say the majority view is that the wing should be very long. People recognize that. Whereas in economics, everyone takes a view. At one level, it's justifiable because economics is part skilled information, part it is the gut feeling, and experts very often do get captured by the powerful, and then they begin to serve that. But these are just warning signals. With those warning signals, we have to give a broad base, countries, people, as much of a voice as possible, and then try to navigate the space between experts having their space and still decisions being taken. And in the end, I'm not completely sure that we will win this battle. There are battles in life which we may not win, in which case we will bring the world down, crashing through something dreadful happening politically and socially.
Thank you very much, Professor Basu. Extremely insightful presentation. Two brief points to illustrate my question. One is on your first part of the talk on globalization. It's been said that the architecture of globalization, the various pieces of globalization, trade, investment, trade routes, communication, all of those have been somehow one way or the other systematized, or there are international organizations who have developed norms and conventions and treaties to manage. One major piece that is missing in globalization is human mobility. And that is still out there. And I represent IOM, International Organization for Migration, and we're working towards, there's a global compact for next year. So my question to you in that regard is, looking ahead in the process leading to the global compact, in your opinion, how do you see that compact? To what extent it should be market-driven as opposed to negotiated, politicized, and normative? So that's the first question. The second, a lot of people here, I'm sure you know about the SDGs, and the first SDG is reduce or eliminate extreme poverty, which is, I think, a universal goal and we all subscribe to. But as you just said also, that there is a huge inequality. And without sounding sarcastic about it, should it not have been eliminate extreme wealth? Because the, I think, top 10 world wealthiest people control about 60–70% of the world resources and wealth. So your thoughts on that would also be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, let me go backwards. On the second one, actually I fully agree. I have been writing that earlier removing poverty has been there in our discourse for a long time, whereas inequality, attending to inequality directly was not a part of the discourse. It was almost the I word. You did not utter that. And one of the reasons for that is talking about poverty eradication is something distant. You're doing good to others. Whereas as soon as you talk about inequality, you worry a little bit about what's going to happen to your own wallets. Because most people conducting the discussion will probably lose out a little bit if you're attending to this. But I feel that's no reason to stay away from that. You have to attend to this, and wealth is the main thing. The world's resources are captured, and then they are passed down dynastic lines. So large numbers of people are being completely left out of that. And so the inequality has to be tackled on many fronts, but one of the most important things, I believe, is transmission from one generation to another, which gives disproportionate advantage to a whole lot of newborns and disproportionate disadvantage to a whole lot of newborns. That is the first step where you need to correct. And taxation is a system that has to be used, because people who do well, it's not just talent, even if it was your talent. There is something moral about being able to share, but it's not just that. A lot of it is our talent working on a world where a lot of the knowledge over thousands of years has been brought on a platter to us. So we ought to give back something. And here I understand that individuals who have done well, they may not want to, people immediately say, why don't you give that up? Bertrand Russell had a beautiful essay, I've recently referred to that, should socialists smoke good cigars? Because that would be the criticism immediately. You're smoking a good cigar. There are people who are well off. But I feel even people who are well off, they may not want to give up individually. But a whole lot of them, luckily, there is a voice today in the US, I meet people who say that the system needs to be taken on. And these are some very well-off people that we have to do something about that. So it's just yes is my answer to that. On human mobility, again, there was a strategic silence. You'll see some conservative writers in the 1960s, 70s, economists, complete free market. You should allow capital to flow from one country to another. You should allow goods to flow. You should allow... But there would be a silence on labor. You don't utter it for fear that it'll come into discourse. There were exceptions to that. Milton Friedman would talk in terms of even labor mobility, but for most people it is a hushed silence. You talk of free movement of everything excepting labor. Again, this has to be brought into the public discourse, labor mobility, labor movement, and there is something on the table. I can understand people who have created a country taking a view that we don't want a huge rush of people to come in and destroy the very fabric of society that we have created. There are ways in which we can tackle that. First of all, this has to be beyond the table. You discuss this openly. Thanks to modern technology, you can allow others to participate without immediately having to cause a rush of people coming in. But because we usually take a stand on both these, we will not allow long-distance technology to come in, nor allow the people to come in. That we are precipitating a problem. There was a meeting in Japan where I was talking in terms of Japan in many ways is a very exclusive society that has affected Japan's growth. Minimally, what Japan should do much more, and it can actually get its growth back up going, is employ people far away by using technology which will allow you to do that. If they do that much more, their firms will become much more efficient and will be able to compete over there. Little fear comes from the new protectionism that you're seeing in industrialized countries, rich countries. The United States is a good example. I like to believe that will not last too long, because if you go protectionist in that manner, where you're not using labor that is far away, let alone movement of people, you will lose out on the commodity market international competition. You'll produce commodities by more inefficient methods. You'll get outcompeted by other countries, many of the middle-income countries like China, coming in and out-competing you are going to lose out. So this is something that ought to be on the table. Once upon a time, I used to take a lot of interest in the global compact in terms of labor market policies. I've written a couple of papers on this, but the time has come to address that in terms of mobility.
Good evening, Professor Basu. My name is Harjot. I'm currently interning at the World Trade Organization.
Where is this coming from? Yeah.
Okay.
Not that I need to know where it's coming from, but still.
Okay. So I have two quick questions for you. Firstly, you mentioned that we need to have profit sharing. how should we go about profit sharing? Through a universal basic income, or do we need sort of a low-cost, high-quality healthcare, education systems? How should this mechanism work? And secondly, and this comes from something that I'm working on, is you've discussed about this increasing protectionism, and it's also seen in a lot of the free trade agreements. But you see a lot of these bypass happening through the labor linking, through communication technologies that you spoke of. In your opinion, how would you suggest the free trade agreements that are currently being evolved or being discussed, how should they take into account these labor linking, protectionism? How should that work? Thank you.
Thank you very much. When you were talking about dictatorship and a culture of mutual fear and groupthink, the organization that I immediately thought of was the World Bank, because it's only ever been run by Americans. In fact, you had a fantastic Nigerian candidate last time who was eminently qualified, but of course the Americans stepped in, imposed your dictator again. And was it this groupthink that led to the sort of expulsion of first the Marxists and then the Keynesians, so that you ended up with total economic groupthink, which led to the disaster of structural adjustment for so many years, when all the evidence showed it was causing great damage to people in many parts of the developing world?
Yes, very briefly. Couldn't one use the same argument of saying, and rightly so, that a newborn didn't choose to be born in a poor family? The analogy you made, whether it was because they worked hard and we all laughed about it. Couldn't we say the same thing in support of the gentleman's claims on mobility? The poor people from poor countries didn't choose to be born in poor countries, and the rich people from rich countries, the same. Thank you.
Okay. The nature of the profit sharing, it is actually literally what the expression I used. It is profit sharing. So it's not universal basic income, it's a flat income that the government collects and gives out to people. I think there are a couple of risks. First of all, that over time, these are going to be eroded by inflation. And also, there are good times and bad times, and there is no collective sharing on that. Whereas a profit share has an attractiveness that you are actually getting some right of ownership to what is being produced in the country or ideally in the world. It ought to be supplemented by healthcare, and so I believe that the big state that some people argue about, I do hesitate about that. I feel the state should do some transfer from one group to another, but should do with a minimal surgical action, and a profit share is like that. You write down some rules and money goes to some people through that. But you do want the state in health and education, since you mentioned that, indeed, that is important, and you want to keep that up. Free trade agreements and the problem that you get from goods being produced far away through other technology, well, there is a mechanism. The origin of the product, there are rules about that. So when two countries strike a free trade argument, we do look at the origin of where the product is coming from. If it's produced in a third country, then you are actually violating the free trade agreement between them. So there are some provisions for that. On free trade argument also, in general, I feel it's good to countries get into clusters about this, but there is a bit of a risk that small clusters can become oppressive vis-a-vis other clusters and the rest of the world. So that is what you need to watch out against. And your question on the World Bank, I actually do believe that the World Bank should be much more open in its selection of leaders. And for that also, you do need to empower the voice of countries in a way different from the way the World Bank does. It's something that actually I have written about a little bit on the importance of doing that. But you know that these are usually, once you have a system going, there is a sense of rights that develop in that. And what we are seeing is that the continuation of that. The groupthink, I'm not completely sure that I followed you. There is a risk with all groupthink. There's no easy solution. Human beings get into this. You begin to think something is correct, and that idea becomes very pervasive. And we've seen some of the most dreadful practices which become a part of the groupthink. And that's why you do need voices of people who are outsiders to be guaranteed that minimal space where you can stand up and violate the groupthink without being brought to harm. And as soon as one talks of this, you think of the Greeks, of course, that democracy, Athenian democracy was premised on that, but nevertheless we do know that Socrates was put to death, and this has happened, that individuals who took a viewpoint different, you immediately begin to silence that. But I feel that should be a part of the collective, that you leave people at least a voice to speak out and take a different line and don't silence that. That should be my view, and a whole group that I belong to may have a particular view. But there should be a prior constitutional commitment that voices should be allowed. So the freedom of speech in that sense is important, and we should allow for that. The newborn, the question, I'm completely with you, that a person born in another country is like a person born in a slum, and a person should not suffer because of that. I personally do believe, and this I'm not saying just for rich countries, even for middle-income countries vis-a-vis poorer countries, there should be the free movement of people. This is going to be difficult, but you have to take that on. But once you allow for free movement of people, which forces you to adjust, you will in fact attend to other problems, like making it better where these people are currently located, so that they don't have to utilize their ability to move freely. But yes, the newborn's location is to me as wrong as a newborn's wealth difference to start with. But a part of this wrong is, of course, the wrong of nature, which we human beings should collectively try to correct as much as possible.
Hi, Professor. So I was very interested, very curious about this last half of your discussion, where you talk about McCarthyism, where people are scared to voice their opinion because somebody else might come and hurt them for dissenting. Now, I'm thinking the only people who are capable of voicing their dissent are people who are outside the system. So there is no enforcement of this kind of harm. But there is another problem that people who are from within the system, they might be worried, or they might believe that, oh, because you're outside the system, you do not represent my objectives, or you do not represent me. Now, if this is the game, the kind of game, what can the outsider do? And I'm thinking of in terms of India, what can the outsider do and speak so that A, they connect with the people who are within the system, but at the same time are able to voice their dissent? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your remarks. I'm going to revert to the Game Theory and International Affairs course you taught a few years ago. So UN Secretary General Guterres mentioned a few days ago that the UN, in reforming itself, should return to Enlightenment values. And specifically, he referred to the idea that we're living in not only a multipolar world, but a world that is in dire need of increased multilateral organization. And you kind of referred to this in your remarks as well. How do you fit, and this is maybe a controversial question, how do you fit this idea of regime loyalty in this international regime that we are living in with his remarks? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Professor. And first of all, thank you for a very fascinating and somewhat provocative speech. I used to be a diplomat for 20 years, most recently in your country, but you probably soon realize I'm no longer. In the sense that, first of all, I disagree with you that globalization is irreversible. History shows us the opposite. Globalization, you said it's irreversible. It's like, you can complain about it, but you cannot do anything about it. I think I tend to disagree with that. if, depending, of course, how you define globalization. But if you define globalization by, for example, globally integrated production system based on trade agreements, they are by definition reversible. Now that brings me to my question. You talk about democracy, and you describe the obvious right of people to choose their leaders, but you didn't talk so much about the precondition for making a, informed choice and the alternatives. If you can choose between five leaders who have one thing in common, namely not caring about their people, what is the value of democracy? Secondly, democracy also has an output side, normally laws, rules and regulation, and economic policy, financial policy. If you have a huge country, which is by all definitions democratic, as we normally refer to it, where the financial resources of the government is equivalent of countries in this part of the world with a fraction of the population, how democratic is that? Now, that brings me, connecting the two. What I observe is that in the discussion between, which powers and rights to protect in the globalized integrated economy, certain interests prevail at the expense of others. And it's fascinating, not to say somewhat frustrating, to note that the most populous countries in the world tend to have the biggest problem with rights that could protect workers. Can you elaborate on that?
Voices outside the system, that's actually increasingly important. And it's also feasible in a way these things can change because voices reach all over now through social media and otherwise. It's very often being pointed out that in countries now, the most important media is the foreign media because country leaders are sensitive to what the foreign media is saying. The foreign media does not have the kind of pressures that can be brought on the domestic media. So the outsider's voice is an extremely important voice. The outsider also has interests. So it is possible that intelligence agencies of another country will influence the voice that is coming in from outside to influence you. So there is a risk over there. But one likes to believe that, and it relates to what was asked earlier, that something that an individual in the system may not be able to stand up and dissent. Once you're outside, you have more moral space. So people with moral voices find it easier to speak from outside than from inside. And this is not something that we should look down on those who are inside and not able to speak. The cost can be huge. So the outsider's voice is extremely important, and we have to nurture and keep this up. But this is going to ding dong. There are countries that will try to cut off an outsider's voice from coming into their country. I'm told that after World Cup soccer takes place in North Korea, there is celebration that North Korea has won the soccer match because the information is so controlled that the people are told that they have won it, so they tend to celebrate. So countries do put barriers and make it very difficult for information to move, but the voice from outside is important. But for both voice from outside and voice from inside, I am stressing the moral side, the common morals, which I think is common to human beings. It's harder if you're inside, and people will be cautious, and we should be understanding of that. It's easier outside, but it is the moral voice we have to give ourselves the space to utilize that. Since she was my student, the UN Secretary General's comment, regime loyalty, actually relates to a larger question of loyalty. Loyalty is a very troublesome concept. We've just seen actually a play of loyalty take place in the United States very recently, where the question was, are you loyal to me, or is it honesty that you are going for with Comey? Loyalty throughout has this problem, and I really don't have a solution to this, because in order to run systems, you need a certain amount of loyalty. The people you're running with, if you think of small corporation, small office, you need people around you who are loyal. But loyalty can also have the whole ship go completely in a crazy direction. People are more loyal than they are honest, and it goes haywire. What do you do? What status should loyalty have? I think, again, you have to carry this in your head. Recognize that loyalty does have, so the way I look at it is that if I'm working in a part of the system, like when I was in the Indian government, that there are certain things where if it's an order that I'm getting from the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister, I have a whole set of things where my view is not critical. When it comes as an order, it's my loyalty to the system, I have to do that. but it's a loyalty with boundaries. So it's not that on everything I'm going to intervene by saying my view is this is good for India. So if the government takes a decision, tax rate should be something, I shouldn't immediately start sabotaging that because my view is different. But I may have views on certain things. That religious bigotry is something that I will not tolerate, and if that order comes, my loyalty to the regime is not good enough. So on loyalty, my general advice is that we have to carry in our heads certain domains where loyalty has to get precedence over other things in order to allow a system to run, but there are also other areas where you decide that it is your integrity, it is your morality, whereby, whether it be a regime or anything else, you stand by that rather than by loyalty. And the irreversibility, I exaggerate, of course, when I give the gravity example. Even on gravity, who knows, someday scientists may do something. But globalization, there are certain aspects of globalization. You can indeed go slow, you can try to put a block to that. So I overstated, though my view is that a lot of our social life, and this is a bit of a Kafkaesque view, is a lot of life is no one's doing. We tend to believe that whenever we see something, we say, who's done it? Whereas very often things are, like globalization is the outcome of hundreds and thousands and millions of people taking little actions which are leading to that. So yes, some parts you can collectively try to block, but a lot of it you will not be able to. The part of your question which is again troublesome, and I was alluding to earlier, is how informed are people who are participating in the decision making? What did you say? The precondition for informed choice, whether they are or not. This is the problem of democracy. The downside of democracy is you're giving voice to a whole lot of people who are not in a position to utter. Like I was saying, what would be comical is if I built an aeroplane by saying that a whole lot of people have collected and I'll take votes on everything, from the angle of the nose to the wing size, we will do it democratically. That plane will not fly, and we all agree. But somewhere you have to draw a line between informed choice, but that becoming an alibi for not giving people voice that you don't know enough. And you get that all the time. Trolling usually is saying that you know nothing. Why are you speaking on this? And you try to silence the other side. But this is a matter on which I don't have a solution. Populist countries, I did not catch your last question very well, but if you're saying that rights do get trampled.
My observation is that when there's an international discussion about which rights to protect, what rights to defend, human rights, labor rights, tend to run into the greatest resistance in countries with the most people, in the most workers, who may or may not benefit greatly from the absence of rights protection.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see, I'm actually fully aware of that, and you can see that there's one genuine reason why it can happen and one false reason. One is, of course, you want to be popular to certain segments and you play to the gallery. The other is where I feel that in some of these decisions, the rights are overutilized. And so occasionally you pause and say that this should not be a right. Maybe not because you think that that ought not to be a right, but the philosophical precept that when you say something ought to be the case, it must be that that can be the case. Whereas if you write everything is a right, then you're making a bit of a travesty of right. I'm actually taking it to domestic situations. I do know this from debates in India, where there are demands for things being made into rights, which is such a canvas of things you want to put as rights, is what you'll do in the end is you're going to that word right will become a meaningless thing that you will not be able to fulfill. So that's the genuine part. The wrong part is, yes, people do play to the galleries and very often don't stand up for rights. And I do believe that certain critical rights are extremely important, and that ought to be a part of our mindset. You don't even need the law to guarantee that right, that respect to people. That should become part of our mindset and way of thinking.
Thank you very much. I know there are some questions in the room, but I think tomorrow is also another day, another opportunity to interact with Professor Basu. Day after, Wednesday. Wednesday is a good opportunity with another talk by him at the economics department. And thank you very much for being here. I think I would like to close the discussion. You've had a very long day. And thank you very, very much for this wonderful.